Tonight we're going to talk about Lola Russell, who is an extraordinary woman. This is what Lola looked like. I think it's going to do screen lots of slide shares. But anyway, that's what Lola looked like when I first met her. She was 93. And as you can see from her picture, she was a woman who knew exactly what she wanted. She had written her memoirs, and many editors had had a go at editing them. She wrote them in 1986 when she retired as a school teacher, and thought she'd make lots of money, and she dictated them to her husband on his word processor, and nothing happened with them really. And they sat around and sat around and sat around, and various editors had a go, and they said, oh, she's not going to pay much, and oh, well, it's too long, and oh, too rambly. And by the time I met her, people were saying, oh, she's losing her memory. Well, yeah, she's getting a little bit vague. But when I read the story, I thought, what an amazing story. This needs to be told. So I said I would take the project on, and I've loved it. I love Lola, and I love her story. So if you're interested in Melbourne history, this is the woman you should know about. So first of all, we start off with this gentleman, Antonio Atzopardi. And Antonio Atzopardi was a sailor in the merchant marine in the 1830s. Antonio arrived in Melbourne, first put his foot down in Melbourne in 1838. And if you know your Melbourne history, that is 3 years only after white settlement, very, very early on. He came in as a merchant seaman on a boat, and he was on various other, boats around Australia, plying up and down between Melbourne and Sydney. But something about Melbourne really interested him. And so he actually came in to Melbourne to settle. And as far as we know, he certainly is Melbourne's, probably Australia's first Maltese settler. And he is Lola's great-grandfather, which is why we mention him. This is where her story starts in a way. Antonio met a lovely young Scottish girl. He can imagine him wandering up Elizabeth Street in the 1840s. And I use that word street under advisement because it was actually a running sewer at the time. And he was feeling a bit thirsty. So he popped in to a little cafe that was near the post office. And there was a lovely young Scottish girl there as a waitress. And guess what happened? They fell in love. So they got married. She and he settled around the post office area. And there is a lane called Angelo Lane, which is somewhere behind Myers and the back of Myers. And that was named after their first son, Angelo. They had many children, 8 children in all. And they had 5 children, that's right. They settled in a sort of all-trade shop. So he was selling packaged goods, sheets, blankets, pickaxes, whatever. And the gold rush occurred in 1851, and he made a killing. He kept selling up at the goldfields, and he made so much money that he was able to send his wife and children off to Europe for European educations. By the time they came back in the 1880s, it was marvellous Melbourne, and his 2 sons set up as lithographers, and they were lithographers to the Victorian government. They printed many things, including things like theatre programs and government bulletins, all sorts of things. Antonio and his wife Margaret settled in Richmond at Richmond Hill, and they were very well off. And they were doing very well for themselves. They actually were on the government house visiting list. Their second son, Valletta, apparently was a very charming young man, and he met a lovely young girl in Richmond called Jessie. And the parents didn't approve because Jessie was from the wrong end of Richmond. She was a tailoress. Nevertheless, Valletta and Jessie got married in their 20s, and it was a complete disaster. Somehow they managed to have 8 children, but they didn't get on. And so the first 4 children ended up siding and living with their father, Valletta, who like Valletta, they didn't do so well in business. Their mother, Jessie, was a very smart businesswoman and from another Scottish background, very canny. And she did very well. And so she went off. They separated. Occasionally they get together, obviously, because they had 8 children. But she actually, at the end of her life, had 5 or 6 properties, including places in the Dandenongs and in Paran, in the wealthy part of Paran. And her 4 youngest children did very well. The child in the middle, Beatrice, was Lola Russell's mother. And Beatrice, we think she may have had dyslexia or something that was undiagnosed, but she couldn't read and write really until the end of her long life. And so when she was living with her grandparents in Richmond Hill at one stage, they discovered that at the age of 13, she was really completely illiterate. And so they had her apprenticed out as a milliner. And she was a very smart businesswoman. She did very well for herself. And in the 1890s, she had her own counter at Foy and Gibson's in the city. She actually ran a department store in Burnie in Tasmania, and she even shifted up to Sydney and ran millinery shops and fabrics departments in department stores up there as well. So she was quite an independent woman. However, in the 1890s, you probably know, Melbourne was known as Smellbourne because we didn't actually have a proper sewage system, and it was pretty gross. And Valletta, her father, caught typhoid. When he came out, he said he really wanted to have a little business like his father had originally, just selling the odd groceries, the odd food, pickaxes, all sorts of newspapers, what we would call today a milk bar. And so he looked around, and in 1891, he came across this cottage here, which I'm showing you. This is from the State Library, Victoria. It's this little cottage here that was built in 1850. What we are doing is we are standing on the Flagstaff Gardens. Here's the Flagstaff, and we are facing south to the Yarra River. And so this is Latrobe Street here, and this is King Street down here. This cottage still stands, and it is the oldest domestic dwelling in the CBD of Melbourne, 1850, pre-gold rush. The family who had built it were the Heffernans. They built it, they moved out about 10 years later. There were 4 of these little cottages in a row, and by the 1890s, they'd been used as a lying-in hospital, as a doctor's surgery, as all sorts of things. And at the time that Valletta wanted to buy it in 1899, it was owned by a lady who had it as a sort of general all-purpose store. And so Valletta bought it, and he had the shop downstairs and living space upstairs. And there is a plaque on it. It's not a National Trust house, but it has a significant register, a deregister on the Heritage Register. And here is the information here. They misspelt Atzopardi, but it was Atzopardi. And Valletta owned it. He passed it on to his daughter Beatrice, and then his daughter Lola owned it. And they have owned this shop since 1899. It has only been in the hands of 2 families since it was built in 1850, which is pretty extraordinary. So this is what the cottage looks like today. As you can see, it is completely dwarfed by all these big buildings. And so there are actually 2 cottages there. They've changed it. This was the entrance. There was an entrance there. They discovered another door here. But Lola and her husband have their living quarters here and up the top. And there is until recently, a tea shop down here. But this was the general all-purpose store that Valletta had. Whoops, sorry, go back. And so Lola was born into this house. Her parents met in the First World War. He was a serviceman going on R&R, going back to the war, and he bumped into, long story short, you can buy the book later and read it, Lola's mother, Beatrice, and George Russell. And George and Beatrice got married, and because, if you remember, Beatrice was illiterate, when he wrote letters to her from the World War I front, they had to be read by other people. And so he realised that, and he had to be very discreet in his love letters. But by the time he came home, everybody in King Street, and they knew all the people, they knew all the people up and down. It was, Lola describes with great accuracy the names of the hotels and the shops. Everybody knew that Beatrice was getting married to this young man. And when he arrived, there was bunting down the street and a big sort of celebration. So they got married, but at the time they got married, Beatrice was already 39. So by the time Lola was born, everybody in the family knew that Lola would be an only child. Her mother was already in her 40s at this stage. So Lola, being an only child, was a rather spoiled only child. And she said that she used to hide under the counter and listen to the customers and watch the customers. And in those days, of course, there was no television, there were no cinemas, and I don't even think they had a radio at first. But her father, who was the son of a Cornish miner who came out in the gold rush, he was very big on reading aloud, reading Shakespeare, reading the Bible, reading literature. And so Lola grew up hearing this from a very, very early age. And she said she puts her love of the English language and her ability, she's still got a beautiful speaking voice, and her love of drama down to these very early childhood years. So Lola one day was walking with one of the richer aunts, and as she said, her aunt discovered that Lola was a little heathen because she wasn't going anywhere to church. And so the aunt said, well, you better go to that church, and pointed, and that was the Welsh church in Latrobe Street. And so when Lola joined, the family joined, it was a very big social community. And so in the 1930s, it was the Great Depression, there were picnics, there were Eisteddfods, there were sing-alongs, there were play nights, there were all sorts of things. And they did have a little mini Eisteddfod, and they expected all the children to present something. And so Lola, at I think about the age of 8 or 9, turned up and said, I'm going to sing All Through the Night, which is a very well-known Welsh song. And the pianist at the time looked at her and said, are you sure, dear? And she said, yes, I'm going to sing All Through the Night. So she sang All Through the Night. There was stunned silence for about 2 seconds, and then everybody was on their feet applauding madly, thinking, wow, what an amazing voice. So the pianist, who was very well known at the time, Betsy Cohen, took Lola under her wing and said, you need elocution lessons, and you need proper Italian lessons, and you need to have piano lessons, and then you can come back to me for singing lessons. So Lola's teenage years were filled with the study of the arts, and her parents were getting on okay, so they paid for it all. And Lola was the first in her family to go to, she was the first in her primary school to go to a secondary school, which says something about the suburb she was living in. She said it was the bread and dripping end of Melbourne. It was full of poor people. She went to the Errol Street School, primary school in North Melbourne, and then she went on to University High, which had been around only for about 8 years. And she said it was a wonderful, wonderful education. And she describes that a lot more in the book. And by the time she was ready to graduate, yes, she did go to university. She went to the conservatorium to study music. The Second World War had just begun, and she said the place was empty, really. So she ran around as students do, picking and choosing the subjects she liked doing. And by the time she got to the end of first year, Bernard Hines, who was the professor who'd been conducting all the ABC orchestras, came back and said, no, you haven't done Theory 101, you have to remain behind. So she said, oh, bother. So she was doing that theory and thinking, what could she do to fill in her time? Well, she joined the drama group at Melbourne University. She had already done radio drama through answering an advertisement from 3DB, who were looking for child actors and were offering, I think 3OW was the one that was offering to teach children how to present on radio. And she did this as a teenager. And she got a lot of roles, as she said, the cheeky milkmaid or the cheeky servant roles. And she met a lot of very well-known actors at the time. So her interests at university actually gravitated towards drama, and she joined what was the Melbourne University Drama Circle, or Club, sorry, Drama Club. She met a lot of very famous people, and she met later on the likes of Barry Humphries. She was with, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm going to have a glass of water here. Sorry about the recording. And she got a name for actually being a very good actress. She played Catherine in Taming of the Shrew and quite a lot of other good roles. And she also developed a love of cinema. And one night she went to the cinema and she said she tripped over a large umbrella, and I thought, for heaven's sake. There was a young man there who was quite shy. She thought, anyway, to apologise, he asked if he could take her out for a coffee. And she thought, oh, well, that was quite nice. And the next day he turned up with a bunch of yellow roses at the university. And yes, they got married eventually. But George Dixon then became a constant influence in her life. So this is Lola on graduation day, her graduation day with George. Now, George was actually a returned serviceman. Lola, I think, did the longest tertiary course in history. I think it went on for about 10 years because she kept adding things on. So she ended up graduating in arts. She had English and history and music up her belt. The sad thing for Lola was when she was about to do her third year exams at the conservatorium and finish her degree, they said, "I'm sorry, your voice isn't strong enough. You'll never pass. You'll never make it." And she, crestfallen. So she graduated in English and history, and she kept up her drama. And George, having come back as a returned serviceman, was actually permitted to, they offered university education for free for returned servicemen. So George took up archaeology. But if you're anything to do with Lola, you have to take up acting as well. So he ended up becoming an actor, but he was very nervous in the beginning and kept muffing his lines and things. So Lola had been, George had been overseas and come back. Lola was now in her mid-20s and had never been overseas, and she thought she'd like to go overseas and get some drama work there, thinking you'd arrive in England and they'd give you lots of work. Well, that didn't quite happen. And George missed her after a year, so he went over as well. So they were there for 9 years, and she did pick up some work, but then they thought, really, it's piecemeal. And to support herself, they were both teaching at opposite ends of the country. And she thought, no, it's not good enough. And her parents' health was starting to fail a little bit. So in the mid-1950s, Lola returned. And they both lived with her mother and father up in the little cottage because George's mother lived way down in Frankston. So Lola and George were still not married because they didn't have steady jobs, but they were living together. Shh. And with the parents' approval. And Lola had picked up she'd rung up all of her old acting buddies and she got some work. And one of the things that she did get to work with was Robert Helpman. This is Lola at the start of her career. She's a very striking looking woman, as you can see. Then she got some work with Robert Helpman. So Robert Helpman had been a great dancer, but he was also in plays as well. And there was a Noel Coward play called Nude with Violin, which was going around. And yes, Lola was playing a French maid, another servant role. She managed, we'll get to Coburg soon. I'm sorry, this is very sensitive, this mouse. She not only toured Melbourne and Sydney, but she also went to New Zealand with this, and they toured around a lot. And she said she was understudying the main role as well as playing the French maid. And as happens on opening night, I think in 2 or 3 of the situations, the lead lady got sick and Lola had to suddenly step up to the main role and play it for about 10 days in a row. Never got really credit for the billing, but she did it. She was obviously very versatile. When she came back from New Zealand and Sydney, she arrived in Melbourne again, late 1950s, and all the work had been taken up by people. And she thought, what could I do? I've got to get some money. George had already got some work at RMIT, teaching archaeology and a few other things. So Lola applied to the Education Department Technical Division to get work as a teacher. And so she did. She actually she'd already taught in 2 tech schools. And from what I can gather between the lines, she was a bit chaotic and didn't handle the students very well. However, she needed a full-time job. And so her first really big full-time job was actually at Coburg Technical School. So I'm going to read an extract from her book. This is 1951, takes place 1959 to 1961. So this is Lola speaking herself. Except for my radio work, there seemed to be no prospects. I therefore decided to see the technical division of the Education Department. A forthright inspector who told me he had half of Melbourne's actresses and actors on his books told me to report to the Coburg Technical College. I was very well received, being the second woman they had on their staff. I taught boys English and social studies. My coordinator was the famous footballer and coach John Kennedy, who was a wonderful help. It was not easy, as the boys respected men, but found ladies a joke. Nevertheless, I slowly managed to win them over. On a Friday, the staff and I would go to the pub and spell out our woes. Mr. Brown, the headmaster, smiled at me and was very considerate with the timetable. To get to school, now remember she's living in King Street and she doesn't have a car, I would catch the tram at the top of our street, which meandered through Royal Park to Bell Street. I was always running late, but sometimes a member of staff would stop to help me get there on time. I felt protected and special. They all knew I was the actress who would not be staying. Well, that wasn't true. She actually did do some more acting work, but she'd often try and do it at night. So later on in 1961, she says, I returned to my charges at Coburg Technical School and began to do some earnest study at the university again. I was rather crestfallen at my lack of theatre work, and I thought something had to be done. So I started to do an MA, a Masters of Arts Preliminary in History. I enjoyed the lectures immensely, but I had great trouble in getting to them because these lectures were held during the day. Therefore, I asked my wonderful head, Mr. Brown, if he could arrange my timetable so that I could attend lectures when I was off duty. And that is what he did. So soon after that, Lola is quite experimental. She's really a pioneer in many things. And as soon as they saw films, they brought a camera together, tried to make their own films. They went to film festivals. They did all sorts of things. They got into television when it came in early as well. And she was on Consider Your Verdict and Beauty and the Beast and a few of the very early shows. And she was also looking through a bookshop one day, Hall's bookstore, and came across some Harold Pinter plays and a Samuel Beckett play. This was very avant-garde. Samuel Beckett was a theatre writer of the absurd. And she saw his play Endgames. She read it and liked it and wanted to perform it. Endgames, even people who love Samuel Beckett say that Endgames is very difficult to understand and to produce. But Lola is recorded as being the first person in Australia to produce a Samuel Beckett play in Australia. And from that, she called on friends and students and all sorts of people to help. And from that, she developed her own theatre company called Lola Russell Productions. Lola Russell Productions was in business really until the mid-1980s. They performed in small theatrettes like the AMP Theatrette in the city, the Russell Street Theatre, before the MTC took it over. They were one of the first people to produce a play at the Alexander Theatre at Monash University, at the Agora Theatre at La Trobe University, and also at a theatrette in Melton. And they were also invited to the Adelaide Fringe Festival. So she was sort of on the fringe, and she based it on avant-garde plays and also plays on the school syllabus because she thought at least we'll get an audience. So there was quite a bit of Shakespeare as well. So she was producing a Harold Pinter double bill, and so her first professional appearance with Lola Russell Productions in a professional theatre venue was in Russell Street, and it was a double bill of Harold Pinter plays called The Dumb Waiter and The Room. They found a free venue to rehearse in, but they needed props. So here now I quote again from Lola's book. However, at Coburg Technical School, there were woodworkers. I persuaded one by the name of Mr. Woods, would you believe it, to build us a set for the dumb waiter. Unfortunately, he used cheap materials. And when we erected it, 1 week before we were due to move into the Russell Street Theatre, a professional set builder, Don, pronounced that the whole thing looked like a dog's hind leg. Anyway, the play went off very well. They started employing full-time staff at Coburg Technical School, and so her services were no longer needed, and she was quite happy about that. 2 years later, in 1963, she says, and I will quote again, as soon as February came, I'd decided to see the education department again and explained my career to them because she wanted to be performing at night. This time I went to the high schools division where Mr. Schrum was the inspector in charge of staffing. He dismissed my fears of never being re-employed and told me there were no terrible reports on me. With those encouraging remarks, I was sent to Coburg High School, and there I was determined to be a model teacher. Coburg High had acquired an academic status and inculcated top expectations in its students. The journey there was easier as it was situated in Bell Street, almost on a tram stop. Coburg Technical School was in the outer ring of the city then and a long walk from public transport, so it was easy to be late because of this. The students at Coburg High all wore neat uniforms and seemed respectful and pleasant. I was given English, history, and some French with junior and middle school. Now, I'm sad to say that is all she mentions of Coburg, but it did set her up because she gained confidence as a teacher. Her next teaching assignment was at Williamstown Girls High, and she loved that school. And I've met people who were taught by her, and they still remember her very well. She taught 9 years there. She taught 9 years. She went back to University High as a teacher, but she said in the 70s the unions were getting in. They'd made it not a special school anymore, and she didn't like it. She didn't think they had respect. And then she went to Brighton High School, which no longer exists, but they had a drama competition, so she was in her element, and she loved it there. She really did. But acting was actually her first love. Teaching was what brought in the bread and butter. And she taught until her retirement in 1985. But she much preferred to be acting. One of the things that she did, here is George and Lola together, they produced a Strindberg play, and they produced it at the Turak Swedish Church, which, if you know where that is, it's in St George's Road. It was actually Melbourne's Victoria's first government house in the 1880s. But they took hold of the top room and they produced this play. And it is about actually a man who goes insane. And at the end, George said he had to wear a straitjacket. When he spoke to me 40 years later, he said that was still one of the most terrifying things he ever had to do, be in a straitjacket. He said it really wasn't pleasant. So now for some reason I'm going backwards. So I thought I would now, I'll just check on the time here to see I'm not going over time. I thought I'd show you a few pictures of Lola here. Who does this remind you of? Most people I know say Meryl Streep. And when I said to Lola when she was in her 90s, you look like Meryl Streep, she went, ooh, and sort of giggled and thought that was lovely. And this is what I call the don't mess with me photo. But she's still a champagne blonde. And here we have Lola. When I met her, she had written this amazing memoir. And I took it on to edit, and I looked at it and it was confusing. Someone said to me, why don't you put the dates in the book? I said, her date remembrance wasn't all that accurate. And some events happened before and some events happened after, and I had to somehow get it in some sort of order. So I did a bit of research and I discovered that the average memoir history book is about 100,000 words long. I wonder if you can guess how many words Lola had written. I was given a manuscript of over 401,000 words. So I had to reduce it by 4 or 5 times. So I thought, what do I do? I asked people, I was telling them about what I was working on, and everybody said, oh, that lady, oh, the cottage. So I based everything around Lola's memoirs around the cottage. So all of her overseas experiences became a paragraph. Thank you. There went 12 chapters into the bin, and I could now see a light at the end of a tunnel. There was a fascinating history of George's family, but that's not Lola, so that went as well. Finally, I tidied it up and I handed it back to Lola, and she just said to me, well, I want a published book and I want a book launch. And I thought, gosh, I'm the sort of person who stresses out having 6 for a dinner party. How am I going to do a book launch? So I got a lot of help, which was great. And I did learn about how to get a book published, self-publishing. And no, this is, whoa, skipping again. This particular date was the 19th of November, 2017. And I don't know if you know what you were doing then, but I was trying to survive an extremely humid day. Humidity and I are mutual enemies. And I arrived at this launch quite, well, I'll say perspiring, my mother would say, with a little glow, and with a splitting headache. And I thought, how is Lola going to survive? Well, Lola turned up in beautiful black velvet dress, when she puts this fur stole around her neck, it goes from floor to floor. The pearls and the most to die for pair of red-haired satin shoes I'd ever seen. And she was now the famous actress again. She was just gorgeous. And so that was a number of years ago. This is Lola in July this year. She's lost her husband, sadly. She's lost her little dog. And the cottage is now not actually, because she's not there, it's actually also not livable. It's actually falling apart, and we're trying to work out how to sustain a 1850 cottage built with pre-gold rush mortar, which crumbles as you look at it every time the underground goes past. So Lola is still, she's quieter. She hasn't got the use of her legs, but she has met somebody who studied with her at the conservatorium in the 1940s, believe it or not, and they share the same table, and she plays the piano, and Lola enjoys herself. So this is Lola. I do recommend, not just because I edited it, but I do recommend this book. It is an amazing read. It's a fantastic story. Even though I've cut so much out, it's really interesting. And we chose this, it's going back again. I am proud to say that my editing work on this was shortlisted for an editing award, but there's some wonderful photos there, a wonderful history. I only told one side of Lola's story. She's also mentioned about her father's side, and a lot about the aunts and uncles. And, you know, it's a real slice of Melbourne life from 1830s to, well, up until 1985, really, and a lot about the acting world. It's very well written. She has a wonderful command of English. And it's a wonderful, wonderful story. So I have put the details here, but I've also put them in the chat box to share. If you remember my name, you can just Google it and you'll probably come up with Creative Text. It's Creative Text Solutions, which is my company name. And that website, Creative Text Solutions, I'll put the email there if you'd like to talk to me. But Creative Text, there's a flap that says books, and you look down and it says Lola Russell City Kid, and you can order a book online, and I will send you one out. So that is, I was told to go for half an hour. I think I've gone a little bit over. I thank you for your indulgence. I love talking about Lola. She's a gorgeous person, and it is a wonderful story, and I'm sorry I haven't got time to mention it all, but I hope that was sufficient Coburg related history for you, and thank you very much for coming tonight.